And I provided for the wood offering at the appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. Nehemiah is basically just like I tried my best. But the problem is the hearts have not changed. So the people who have been brought back from exile, they're seeking to live comfortably. They're seeking to go about their business instead of saying, what does God want me to do? What does God ask me in my life? Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Renewal Bible in Your podcast. My name is Pastor PJ Arsfold, and this is week 32, and we are finishing up the book of Nehemiah, and then we're getting into the books of Chronicles, and after that, we are done with the Old Testament. So we are really closing in on the end of the Old Testament here. Now, as we pick up in Nehemiah, I just want to remind you where we left off. So Nehemiah was over in the empire, over in Persia, and he wanted to come back. He had heard that the walls were torn down, and so he had asked for release to go back and help rebuild the walls, and there's this whole saga of rebuilding, and then they dedicate the walls, they celebrate with the Feast of Booths, and then we had in chapter 9 this kind of big confession on behalf of the people and Nehemiah's prayer that basically just recounted the whole history of God's people from here's what we did, and I think I had mentioned it's kind of summed up really nicely when Nehemiah says, basically, you've acted faithfully and we've acted wickedly. Okay, so they're confessing their sins and asking for kind of a fresh start. So that gets us to chapter 10, where you have the people making a covenant. And so they are, again, this is one of those relational agreements where the people are kind of binding themselves to God and making pledges and vows. Basically, in light of your faithfulness and you bringing us back, here's what we're going to do. So in chapter 10, we start off with a list of some of the names on that covenant. And so you might recognize some of the names. Some of them only pop up here. But nevertheless, you have, I think it's like 27 verses of names of people who signed it. And then as you get into verse 28, we're told that the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who have separated themselves from the people of the lands to the law of God, basically they kind of join with their brothers and to enter into this kind of curse and oath. So this is a lot like when we had Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, these two mountains in Deuteronomy and in Joshua that kind of emblemized, they really represented blessing and curse for obedience or disobedience. So similarly here we have kind of a renewal of that where the people are entering into this oath and acknowledging that if we disobey, there's a curse. And so they vow to keep this oath. They want to not buy on the Sabbath on the holy day, or on a holy day. So they're going to honor the Sabbath and the Sabbath holidays. Will forego the crops of the seventh year. So that's part of the Sabbath practice. They're not going to extract every debt with interest and such. So basically, they're going back to the laws that they were supposed to be following, and they're saying, hey, in light of God's will and in light of God's mercy and forgiveness, here we are, we're recommitting ourselves to do this as well. And then in verse 32, they take it to give a third part of a shekel for the service of the house of God. So they're all going to donate to the temple and contribute to the worship and the corporate happenings there. And then I think in verse 9, they kind of sum it up with, basically, we will not neglect the house of our God. So you can see here, having lost the first temple and now having rebuilt the second temple, rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, there's a huge emphasis that they're saying, we're not going to neglect this temple anymore. We're going to treasure it. And you can see kind of their turn of heart after all that they've gone through. Then in chapter 11, really interestingly, they realize that in order for Jerusalem, in order for the temple, in order for all of that kind of center of life to happen, that some people are going to have to live in Jerusalem. So basically, they come together and they have 1 out of every 10 people to live in Jerusalem. So for some of them, they cast lots. So again, imagine like just drawing names out of a hat or rolling a dice or something. Or some of them willingly and freely offered to go move to Jerusalem. And I think this is a really interesting idea in terms of the people realizing in order for the temple to work and for it to be taken care of, in order for this city, this place that we're going to, make our annual pilgrimage 3 times a year to for these festivals and for the kind of the center of our people, we need people to live in Jerusalem. And if you lived out in a village, you might have, more land, you might have fields. And so for not everyone, it wasn't always desirable to move to the city. I guess each one is their own, right? Everyone has their own preference. A lot like today, like whether you want to live in a city or suburban or rural setting, like a lot of that's your personality, but sometimes you're kind of forced via job, employment, family, stuff like that. So for the people, they thought, hey, in order for the temple and in order for our worship to work and in order for this holy city to function, we need people to live in Jerusalem. And so they have 1 out of every 10 people move back to Jerusalem now that the walls are up. And I think, I guess the most modern equivalent would be if you're part of a church and you participate in the ministry, you believe in the work that God's doing there, taking that location into mind when you think through things like, I'm going to buy a new house. So typically when people are, moving, they think through, all right, what's the commute to work going to look like? Do I have family nearby? I'd love to be close to my in-laws or my parents so we could, bring the kids over or something like that. And the idea of maybe our churches should also just be a factor. Not that you can never, leave your church, right? If you move or your job moves you to a different state or something, but to think through, if I really care about the ministry of this place, maybe if I am moving, or I keep in mind, like, how can I still be within a range where I can participate in this place, where I can volunteer, where I can pour into that neighborhood, whatever that might look like. It's kind of an interesting testimony you have here of people saying, I'm willing to uproot my life for the sake of God's people and our worship. And maybe for all Christians to think through, I should take churches into consideration, when I'm thinking about where I'm moving. It's not first and foremost, what's the biggest house I can get, what's the most land, but rather, where can I be a part of a church that I believe in, that I'm connected to, that I want to continue the ministry? Again, I don't want to make a law of this because you'll notice that 9 out of 10 people don't move to Jerusalem, but I think it's an interesting thought to consider in terms of what are our priorities? Because for the people coming back from exile, they collectively agreed, hey, we need people living in Jerusalem. Like, that's not a non-negotiable. So let's get some people, quote unquote, closer to the church, and let's have some people who can do that. So just kind of an interesting thing to think there. You have a list of all the people who moved to Jerusalem. You have kind of just some more lists of priests and sons of Benjamin, Levites, gatekeepers. You have all of these different roles. And then you have the villages and some of the names of those. So again, this is really chronicling for us and really trying to record for us all of these different people and happenings. These are almost like record keeping sometimes. So when people look back, they're like, all right, that's where that village came from. All right, so these are the families that got to Jerusalem, or here's the families that stayed out, whatever that looks like. In chapter 12, then, we have some more section on the priests and the Levites. And again, this is more listing of people. You'll see some common names. You'll see like Ezra. You'll see Zerubbabel. You'll see Iddo. He's popped up a few times. At least that name has. There's a prophet Iddo, and then seems to have been a name of that period. In verse 16, you have Zechariah. You have in verse 23, you have reference to the book of the Chronicles. And we'll get to the book of Chronicles here, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But again, so you have a reference to that. And then you have Nehemiah and Ezra again mentioned. You have the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem. They celebrate with gladness. There's singing, thanksgiving, cymbals, harps, lyres. It's just kind of a big celebration. The singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem. I just love this. It's like almost like it's not really like what we think of as an art commune, but I just like the idea of all these like singers and artists kind of like living together as they want to live near Jerusalem so they can participate in all of this worship and the regular happenings. They purify the people and the gates and the wall. So there's a big consecration. There's a big emphasis to, again, ordain this as something, God is blessing. God, please bless these walls. Please bless this town. Please bless these people who serve. I'll say this too. We have 2 great choirs. So again, not only do you have these singers and villages, but 2 large choirs, however big great is. And then we're told that the joy can be heard from far away. So again, the neighboring places hear the rejoicing and the celebration that's taking place in Jerusalem. I'll just highlight this too. At the very end of this chapter, you have a list of some of those who serve in the temple. So there's people who help with storerooms, contributions, and tithes. You have, obviously, we talked about singers, gatekeepers. So you have all of these different roles, and it references the days of David and Asaph. So again, thinking back to our period in kind of Second Samuel into First Kings and such. I highlight this because, again, I think what's beautiful about when we think of church work, when we think about the work of the church, it's more than just a pastor. The work of the temple is not just the priest. Now, the priest is important, right, to offer sacrifices. They have a designated role. But the temple functions because there's people who are willing to clean utensils, because there's people who are willing to watch the gates. There's people who are willing to count the money and make sure that it's all getting spent right. And I think when we think about the church today, it needs to be more than just a pastor. It needs to be more than just, you could say, staff, but it's all people contributing in their own way, shape, and form. So crucially, you do need somebody preaching the word, right? An ordained pastor, but you also need, somebody there to help people feel welcome and at home, to be hospitable. You need somebody who has good acumen for buildings or finances or aesthetics and can beautify the space and keep things running well. So there's all of these different roles, janitors, all of those things really help the work of the church function. And it's a lot like that old JFK story. Maybe I've mentioned this before about, JFK's walking through NASA and he talks to a janitor and he says, "What do you do here?" And the janitor replies, "I'm helping get a man on the moon," right? And this, it's kind of like, whoa, isn't that so cool? Because this janitor, he's just cleaning floors and bathrooms, but he understands his role as part of the overall mission of NASA. Similarly, every Christian is called to see my contribution here, the fact that I introduce myself to a visitor, the fact that I volunteer in some way, shape, and form, whether it's through some of our sound system, whether it's children's ministry, whatever volunteering you have, whatever skills or services or time you offer, VBS, whatever it is, that is part of the mission of the church too, and to see that as an integral part of the whole. I think it's just kind of a cool picture whenever you think about temple service. Like there's a lot of roles and a lot of people serving in ways that we don't often think about, even as simple as, cleaning utensils. Love it. In chapter 13 then, this is the last chapter of Nehemiah, and in some ways this is the latest, you could say latest narrative account that we have in the scriptures, because Malachi is often considered around this time as well, but Malachi obviously is prophetic. So in chapter 13, we're told that on that day they read from the book of Moses. So again, they're going back to the scriptures. And in the hearing of the people, they read that they're not to allow Ammonites or Moabites to enter the assembly. So for holy worship, for those big celebrations, you're not supposed to have Ammonites or Moabites because they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them and cursed them. So again, this is calling back to the book of Numbers when Balak, the king of Moab, had hired Balaam to curse them and had sought against them. And then God had turned the curse into a blessing. And so you can see now they're trying to figure out, all right, we went wrong because we sinned. Let's go back to the scriptures and figure out where we can go right. And so they're trying to separate themselves from these people. Now, yeah, we'll talk about, actually, when we get done with Nehemiah, we'll talk about where Nehemiah leaves us a little bit. All right, as we continue on, you have Eliashib, the priest, who is appointed over the chambers of the house of God, who is related to Tobiah. So if you remember, Tobiah is that kind of governor who's been kind of a thorn in Nehemiah's side at times. And we're told that Eliashib basically made Tobiah a large chamber where they used to put grain offerings, frankincense, vessels, and tithes of grain, wines, and oil in the house of the Lord. So it's crazy. So you can imagine this priest, because he's related to somebody who's an outsider, who is actually opposed to God's people, making him like his own house or his own chambers in the temple. I mean, this is insane, right? And here, we're not told, this is not always chronologically, like not every detail is given, but basically, we're told that at this point, when this was happening, Nehemiah was not in Jerusalem. So Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem, he does work, he goes back to Persia. Now he's coming back to Jerusalem because he hears about this. And he throws out all the household furniture of Tobiah, and basically is like, this can't be done, right? I mean, it's crazy that a priest would do that. But again, he's got a relation to Tobiah, so he's got a connection, and maybe the fear of power or intimidation, who knows? But Nehemiah, you can see his care for doing things right. He's trying to get everything done correctly. So the fact that he hears that this foreign governor opposed to God's people now has like a room in the church, like, can you imagine if there was somebody in the government who was trying to shut down Christian churches and we're like, let's just get him an office in our sanctuary? You're like, no, wait a minute. He doesn't need to live here, right? Like, we don't, he can do his thing elsewhere. So be it. We're going to carry on our ministry. But the fact that he's now coming in and can mess with things, can sabotage things, like that's not okay. But this isn't the only thing that's going wrong, because when Nehemiah comes back, he also sees that the portion of the Levites had not been given to them, so they're not receiving their due, right? We just had this whole oath about the tithes and offerings, right? And that's not happening because the Levites aren't getting their portion to live off of. And so basically Nehemiah confronts the officials and says, why is the house of God forsaken? and he appoints treasurers over kind of the money and the storehouses, and he finds people who are reliable, who are going to be trustworthy to distribute what needs to be distributed. Then he has this little prayer in verse 14, remember me, oh my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. So he's trying to help, like, hey, the Levites are not getting their fair share. So there could be a tithes and offering issue. It also could be that the officials, like the priests and stuff, aren't giving their fair share to the Levites. They're hogging too much for themselves. So again, he's putting somebody trustworthy over the finances and the offerings. And then in verse 15, Nehemiah sees the people of Judah treading winepress on the Sabbath and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys. And you have all of this merchandise and work being done on the Sabbath, which we just had a covenant. We just said we won't work on the Sabbath. And now people are back to working on the Sabbath, and they're selling and buying on the Sabbath. And so this is terrible. We have Tyrians also. So think of Tyre, again, merchant city, which makes sense, who live in the city. So they're not observing the laws. They're brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath. In Judah, and I love it in verse 16, he's like, in Judah, in Jerusalem itself. Like, it's not even like this is happening on the fringe of society, like, oh, in some rural town, somebody's breaking this law, but like right here in Jerusalem, everybody, come on, really? Like, again, it would be like if you're coming to church on a Sunday morning and you're just like comfortably just like sinning in front of everybody. Like, it's one thing, like, yes, we all wrestle with sin, we're all working on it, but if you're just like unashamedly, unrepentantly just like doing it and you're sinning in church, right? You'd be like, of all places, like, it's one thing if you're like, you know, kind of putting on a face in church and then you're going back and living a different kind of life, or out on the fringes where we can't see you, but to just be at the heart of everything and to sin, it's just kind of like, for Nehemiah, I can just imagine his mouth just agape, just like, what in the world? So he confronts the nobles and he's basically like, why are you doing this evil thing, profaning the Sabbath? Did not your fathers act this way? And did not our God bring all the disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So Nehemiah here is like, this is what got us into the problems in the first place. Why in the world is this happening? We should not be doing this. And so you can see just kind of his exasperation. So what he starts to do is he says that basically that as it starts to grow dark, when it's about to be Sabbath, he has the gates of the city shut. And basically like, that way nobody on the Sabbath can come in or out. So merchants can't come in and sell stuff. People can't go out to buy stuff for work. They have to stay in Jerusalem. So the doors are shut all day on Sabbath. Now, he says that some merchants and sellers basically lodge outside Jerusalem like once or twice. So you can imagine they show up, the doors are shut, like, all right, we'll just camp out here. And then as soon as the doors open, we can go back to selling our stuff. But Nehemiah says, I warned them and said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. So basically he's threatening them. Like, I will come after you if you keep doing this. Like, you should not be camping out here. Because again, the point of the Sabbath isn't just some arbitrary law, just like some performative thing. The heart of the Sabbath is God takes care of you. God's in control of this world. One day a week you should rest, delight in his word, hear what he has to say, remember his great deeds, right? And so if you're just passing the time like, oh, I can't wait to get back to selling and buying stuff, like, you're missing the point of the Sabbath. So he threatens these merchants and they eventually leave. But we're still not done with the problems, because we're told that he also sees Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, right? The groups that we just talked about that they were supposed to remove themselves from. And half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. So basically they can only speak these foreign languages. They can't speak Hebrew, right? Or it's starting to merge into Aramaic. And I think the reason why this is so significant, this is not to say there's one holy language, especially anymore, and we'll talk about that more in the New Testament. But I mean, if you just think about the role of the scriptures, the role of God's word, the role of his law, if you don't teach your children to that language, right? Especially this time when all of it is in Hebrew and a little in Aramaic, you can't hear it, you can't learn it. If all they speak is foreign languages and presumably then foreign practices, they can't even understand God's law. They can't even understand what he commands of them, what his promises are. And so again, you can just see this lack of attention to God's people, lack of attention to preserving a holiness and a relationship with God, right? The fact that they're going once again to kind of assimilating into other other practices. Now you have to be careful, right? Because this is not to say that anyone who's foreign, who comes from a culture that has a different traditional religion or language, is inherently wrong. And again, one of the things we're going to see in Jesus, especially in Pentecost, when we get to Acts chapter 2, is that the news of Jesus gets spoken by Peter, but people hear it in their own language. So the gospel is not restricted to one language, which is why, like, as an English-speaking pastor, my job is not to teach everybody English so they can understand when I'm talking about the gospel. That's why missionaries learn languages of people so they can go to them and speak in their native tongue. So there's a shift that's going to take place, but understand that at this time and place, everybody speaks Hebrew, and the scriptures in particular are in Hebrew. They're not yet translated to a different language, and we're going to get there in our intertestamental period. But for now, it's Hebrew, it's a little Aramaic, and so you got to know that in order to understand God's law and understand God's promises. And so you see the people still just not paying attention to this, not even caring to think this stuff through. And so you have all these issues. And again, Nehemiah's like going on about how terrible this is. Even like we have one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Elishib, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat, the Horonite. So again, you have even like the high priestly family intermarrying with Sanballat, who's one of those like kind of foreign powers that's like been trying to intimidate God's people. So again, you're having relationships with people who are opposed to the Jewish people, opposed to God's people. So again, it's just kind of like, what is going on here? And he's so worried about all this. So the book ends in a very interesting way. What happens is in chapter 9, you have this big confession. Chapter 10, you have this big covenant and all of their promises. Chapter 11, people are moving to Jerusalem. They're getting situated. Chapter 12, we have this kind of accounting of all these priests and Levites and all of the different roles. And then in chapter 13, basically what we're just told here at the end is that pretty much everything is undone, okay? Like people aren't observing the Sabbath. People are still intermarrying and not caring about true worship. People are neglecting the Levites. So what this book of Nehemiah is leaving us with is Nehemiah has put forth, and Ezra too, but especially in the book of Nehemiah has made so many efforts to get God's people back on track. Let me rebuild the walls. Let me get people back to the right practices. Let me protect Sabbath by passing laws where you can't open the gates on Sabbath. And you see all of this legislation and efforts and reform to try to get the people to do better. And chapter 13 is basically saying, but the people didn't. And the people neglected the law still. And so the book of Nehemiah ends in this very almost sad way where verse 30, this is like Nehemiah just praying to the Lord and just saying, God, I tried, basically. Because he says this. I'm just going to read 30 and 31 here at the end. Thus I cleanse them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work, and I provided for the wood offering at the appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. So it's a really kind of a sad ending because Nehemiah is basically just like, Lord, I did this and I tried this and I did this too, so just remember me. Like I tried my best. I mean, that's one way to summarize it. God, I tried my best. I did what I could. But the problem as we see here is while they come back, there's kind of this renewed effort. There's some new ideas. What we see here is there's still an issue with the heart. And we're going to get into this. I'll talk about a little bit at the end of Chronicles. But people are going to take a little bit of a swing. You're going to have a lot of people who go from a little bit too licentiousness, too much legalism, too much worry about the letter of the law and, not even getting close to breaking the law instead of what is this actually for? What is the Sabbath for? What's the point of it? Is healing somebody breaking the law of Sabbath? Right? I'm not supposed to buy and sell stuff, but like, what if Jesus heals somebody? And there's people who say that's too far, right? So we're going to see a swing to legalism. But through it all, what you're going to see here is there's an issue of the heart. The hearts have not changed. So the people have been brought back from exile, but they're still not in their regular life seeking to do God's will. They're seeking to live comfortably. They're seeking to go about their business. They're seeking to marry whoever they want to marry, right? Instead of saying, what does God want me to do? What does God ask me in my life? And so that's where we're kind of left off at the end of the book of Nehemiah, and that will launch us into the New Testament when we get there in a couple weeks. Now, before we do that, we're going to go to the book of Chronicles. Now, depending if you're reading obviously an English Bible, this is going to come usually after the book of Kings. So to go 1 Kings, 2 Kings, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles. If you picked up a Hebrew Bible, so a Bible in Hebrew, like it was originally written, this is the last book of the Hebrew Bible. It ends with Ezra, Nehemiah, then Chronicles, as a kind of a recap of the Old Testament. And that's the reason why we're putting it at the end, to kind of line up with that Hebrew Bible and to kind of honor that idea of, hey, we've kind of gone through the whole story. We've gone through all the prophets. Let's do one last recap of the Old Testament so we're ready to go for the New Testament. And so that's why we're going to be looking at the book of Chronicles. And what you're going to see here is a lot of common stories, a lot of commonalities that we've seen before. I'll just say this on the front end. One of the questions that Chronicles doesn't answer for us is who's the author? Like, who's writing this? Is it one person? Is it multiple people? There's actually like a leading thought. I don't know if it's leading, but a common thought that this could be Ezra. For a variety of reasons, some of the writing is a lot like Ezra. There's some kind of parallel passages. Ezra, from what we know about him in the book of Ezra, that lines up very closely. Like, that would make sense with his personality and kind of what he's interested in. But we don't know for sure. This could have been somebody else. This could have been Ezra. It could have been multiple people. So typically when we refer to the author of First and Second Chronicles, we'll call them the chronicler. That's the most common term. Just to acknowledge whoever wrote this book, Ezra or somebody else, is the chronicler. And really what Chronicles is doing is recapping, like I said, Old Testament. So you're going to notice it's going to start with Adam, and it's going to give us a genealogy all the way to Saul and David. And then it's going to start recounting for us stories from David and Solomon and the latter kings all the way into exile and all the way to the return from exile. So again, it serves as a good recap. Now, it's believed by many that this book would have been written and compiled from other documents when the people are coming back from exile as kind of a how did we get here kind of idea, which also makes sense if it is Ezra, that he would kind of compile all this. But regardless, it's believed that this was something that we've recorded for us, we've kind of researched, so when we get back to the Promised Land, we can understand how did we get to the golden age of David and Solomon in the temple? Where did things go wrong? How did this kingdom get split? How did we end up in exile? And kind of where are we now? And so that's what the book of Chronicles are really going to capture for us. Now, because so much of this is recapping stuff, I'm not going to dwell on some of these details a ton. I'm going to kind of just keep moving. And you'll notice that the readings in this book is also quite a few chapters per day because it's stuff that you've already kind of covered. And so I'll highlight some key features, just kind of walk through it a little bit. Or if there's some new detail or some sort of difference, I might try and highlight that. There's going to be one in particular today that usually catches people's eyes. But I'm going to start off with 1 Chronicles 1. And again, you'll notice that the first word is Adam. So again, we're starting all the way back, right? The very beginning, this is the genealogy. We're going to start off with kind of all these lineages, starting with Adam. And you'll notice that basically the start of 1 Chronicles sounds a lot like Genesis 10, which was that table of nations, basically like these lineages and all these different people groups. You have Noah referenced, you have his sons, you have places like Cush and Egypt, Canaan, all of these different places. And so basically verses 1 through 24 just get us from Adam to Abraham. And then from then on, in verse 28, you have Abraham and his descendants, so Isaac and Ishmael, and then their genealogy. So we have those who are born to Ishmael. You have Abraham's other children. And then you have the Edomites. So again, those coming from Esau. And you're going all the way down to Jacob, who is also known as Israel. And so you're kind of laying out that part of the genealogy. And then as we get to chapter 2, we have the sons of Israel. So you have those 12 sons of Israel. And then we start going down from them. You have references like in chapter 2, verse 7 to Achan, the troubler of Israel. If you remember, he's the one who, when they had defeated Jericho, had stolen some of the devoted things, some of their household gods, and had stored them in his tent. And as a result, the people had lost against Ai. This was in Joshua. And then he was put to death for his breach of faith. So it's interesting that the chronicler calls him the troubler of Israel, right? Because his sin brought trouble on the whole people. And so then we have him referenced. Going down to verse 15, we get all the way to David, where he pops up in his family. He's the seventh born of his family. We have references later to places like Gilead in verse 21. So just a reminder, Gilead is that territory to the east of the Jordan River. So that's where Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh settle. And so again, it's named after a Manassite named Gilead. And so a lot of the places throughout the Bible are named after somebody. It's very common, not always, but very common that somebody ends up getting the place named after them, as is the case of Gilead, as well as others. In chapter 3, we have descendants of David. And so first, those who were born to him in Hebron. If you remember, he was in Hebron for 7 years and then in Jerusalem for 33 years. So we start off with his Hebron children, and then we go into his Jerusalem children. In verse 10, we get Solomon and his children, starting with Rehoboam, who will be the king after him. So we have kind of Solomon on down. And here you actually kind of go through all of these kings that will come up later. So if you remember all of the kings of especially Judah, the southern tribe, you basically have them laid out here. Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, and so on, all the way down to Zedekiah and Shallum. If you remember, there's kind of a funny ordering towards the end because at that point they were under Babylonian control, so they didn't necessarily go in order of age. But you have all of those kings referenced there in chapter 3, and again, those are the kings who are going to oversee that southern kingdom after it splits after Solomon. In chapter 4, we're going to start getting these specific lineage groups. So here we have Judah, his descendants. So there's a bunch of those. I'll just highlight, there's sometimes these random little details. I think I've said this before, but I love these genealogies where it'll just give you a detail about somebody and you're just kind of like, I wonder why. Like here in verse 9, we have a Jabez who we're told was more honorable than his brothers. And his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain. Jabez would be like the name for pain. And so Jabez calls upon the God of Israel, saying, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my border, and that your hand may be with me, that you would keep me from harm, so that it may not bring me pain. And God granted what he asked. So Jabez's territory grows. Now, for the people living in the promised land, like maybe that was significant. They would have been like, oh, that's how like Jabez's descendants got like that big chunk. But for us, it's kind of a funny little detail it throws in there. But God clearly sees his ask and honors it. And then you have, again, more descendants of Judah and the different families and lineages. You can tell here, too, if you remember in the book of Ezra, when they're looking at genealogies and trying to figure out who is a Levite, who's a priest, you can see here that they try to compile some pretty accurate lists of everybody who's got a part of this, right? So anyways, Judah's descendants, starting in verse 24, we have Simeon's descendants. Now we're told explicitly that Simeon's descendants did not grow. Their clan did not multiply like the men of Judah. So if you remember way, way, way back in Genesis, I think it's like chapters 48 or 49, when Jacob is blessing his children, Simeon, because he and Levi had gone and struck down all of those men when they had defiled Dinah, their sister, Simeon, part of his curse is that he'd kind of be scattered amongst the people. And so here, this is just reinforcing that Simeon never becomes kind of the same like stronghold tribe. They're kind of scattered amongst Judah, and they never grow to the same size. Where Judah is very significant because Judah has this promised blessing from Jacob that the ruler would come from them, which we see first in David, and then we'll see later in Jesus. In chapter 5, then, we have Reuben. And so here, right off the bat, we're told that Reuben was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, sons of Israel, so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son. So if you remember, Reuben had slept with one of his dad's maidservants, concubines. So Reuben was one of Leah's daughters, and he had slept with Rachel's maidservant, who she had given to Jacob. And so there was that whole fiasco. And so this is again an acknowledgement that he lost his right as a firstborn, the prestige and promise, but that was given to the sons of Joseph, which would be Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, what's interesting here is it acknowledges in verse 2, though Judah became strong amongst his brothers, and a chief came from him, that's the ruler, that's David, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph. So it's acknowledging that there was a birthright, kind of the firstborn birthright, the double portion, given to Joseph, and it was taken away from Reuben because Reuben violated his father's couch, slept with one of his father's wives, concubines, whatever you want to say in that term. And then as a result, he lost the firstborn double portion right given to Joseph, which is why Joseph has two sons that each share the stature of son of Israel, Manasseh and Ephraim. And then if you remember, between those two, Jacob blessed Ephraim, even though he was the youngest, that he would be greater than Manasseh. And that's why Ephraim becomes one of the largest tribes, second to Judah, and becomes kind of emblematic of the northern kingdom. Again, this is kind of like a big recap reminder for us as we're closing out this kind of section. In verse 9, then, we are reminded how Reuben settled in the east in the land of Gilead, on the other side of the Jordan, all the way stretching towards the desert side of the Euphrates. And then that leads us right into Gad, which also would have settled in there along with Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh. So you have the descendants of Gad here, and then at the end of the chapter, you have the half-tribe of Manasseh and that descendants from that portion that was over on that side of the Jordan. The other side obviously would have still been in the main western side with the rest of those in the Promised Land. Now, even here in this section of genealogies, we are told that those in the Gilead region broke faith with the God of their fathers and whored after the gods of the people of the land. And so God, the God of Israel, stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, the spirit of Tilgath-Pilser, king of Assyria, and he took them into exile, namely the Reubenites, Gadites, and half-tribe of Manasseh. So because they're on the other side of the Jordan, they are particularly vulnerable. When the Assyrians come to take people off in exile, they're most vulnerable and kind of the first to go. And so we see that kind of play out. And it's acknowledging, too, that even those tribes had broken faith, right? Everybody suffers for their own sin. The whole people had gone corrupt at that point. In chapter 6, then, we have the Levites. And so obviously this is significant for our temple work. And that's why in verse 2 here we have mentioned Aaron, Moses, and Miriam, right? So kind of our big trifecta back in Exodus. Aaron, the first high priest, Moses, the kind of great prophet and the lawgiver, and then Miriam, the prophetess, and their sisters. So we have kind of a lineage here from those three and all of the Levites going down. And we talk about the Levites being put in charge of the temple service. So again, this is a big chapter for understanding the roles and how people are serving. We're told about all these different groups. We have reference to the sons of Korah. If you remember, Korah was this Levite who had led a rebellion in the book of Numbers, where basically he wanted to assert himself and some of his kind of followers to the level of Moses and Aaron, and then he ended up being swallowed up in kind of an earthquake where the earth opened up, swallowed him and his group, and then it closed upon them. But his descendants who stay true to the faith, they don't join him in that moment, and they go on to write many of our Psalms, as does Asaph, who we're told is a great musician, so he's referenced here. So again, a lot of these big names throughout Israel's history in terms of Psalms, temple worship, kind of all mentioned here along with the Levites. In chapter 7, then, we have the descendants of Issachar, we have Benjamin, and Naphtali, which gets like the least airtime. It's so funny. It's one verse. The sons of Naphtali, Jaziel, Guni, Jezer, Shalom, and the descendants of Bilhah. Just like, that's it. All right. Like, yeah, poor Naphtali, pretty small. And then we have Manasseh. So this is the whole of Manasseh. So again, not just restricted to those who are on the east side of the Jordan. Then Ephraim, which is obviously a much bigger group. And then reference to kind of where they settled and where they come from. And the sons of Joseph, so that would be Manasseh and Ephraim, live. We have reference to Asher. And then in chapter 8, we've had Benjamin, but now we're specifically going from Benjamin to Saul. So chapter 8 tracks, how do we get to the first king? How do we get from Benjamin and show that Saul is really part of that lineage? And so we have that kind of genealogy there. Chapter 9, we have a genealogy of the returned exiles. So we're told that all Israel was recorded in genealogies, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was taken in exile in Babylon because of their breach of faith. So again, it's acknowledging why they were. Now, the first to dwell again in the possessions of their cities were Israel, the priests, the Levites, the temple servants, and some of the people of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh lived in Jerusalem. So when the people start to come back from exile, it's telling us who are some of the first to come back. And we're told that you have obviously like Levites and temple servants and priests, pretty essential. But then after that, you have Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh. And I think that's not an accident. So Judah and Benjamin, those are the two that comprise the southern kingdom when they split. So those are the ones that hold faith longer, stronger, before they're taken into exile. And then Manasseh and Ephraim, right? Those are Joseph's sons. Those are the kind of firstborn blessed ones because Reuben had abdicated his blessing. And so I think it's not a coincidence that those are the first to start returning from the exile. Then starting in verse 17, you have a bunch of these roles. I just talked about this in Nehemiah, but a bunch of the different things that people were doing in terms of temple service. And then at the very end of this chapter, you have kind of Saul's genealogy repeated again. So talking about specifically zooming in on Gibeon, and that area, and then the families that then are going to lead us to Saul. And then in chapter 10, we're going to have a little bit of a pivot here, because so far we've basically just done genealogies. Genealogies basically from Adam to the days of Saul and David. And so now we're going to pick up more narrative story, and we want to recount David's kingdom going forward. So you're going to notice we don't have the anointing of Saul. We don't have when Saul's kingdom. We literally start off when Saul dies. So that's significant, because that paves the way for David to become king. So chapter 10, we have Saul's death recounted. Again, you've read a lot of this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on all these details. I'll highlight this though, because again, some of this book is trying to help the return to exiles make sense of what their history was and what happened. So you'll notice, again, even when the exile is mentioned because the people broke faith. Similarly, we just jump into Saul's death, and then verses 13 and 14 tell us this. So Saul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the commandments of the Lord, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. So again, right off the bat, we're told, hey, here was Saul. He was the first king. He died. Let me tell you why. So he broke faith. He consulted a medium instead of the Lord. He didn't keep the commandments of the Lord. That's why he died. Those kind of big three things. And so that's why David becomes king instead. So again, this is trying to help people understand how we got here. Why is it that all of this happened? So that leads us to chapter 11, where David is made king. So chapter 11, and again, some of this can sound familiar, but this is when they anoint David. They ask David to be their king, and he takes over. And so he becomes king. He takes Jerusalem, which was the Jebusites, and then that becomes kind of the center of the kingdom after that. And then in verse 10, you start the section of David's mighty men again. We already looked at this, but it's always fun to see it again, because again, just these crazy feats. There's these three great men, and you have all these stories about them basically single-handedly like getting David a drink of water from a well in Bethlehem, and fighting all sorts of crazy, like outnumbered armies that they overcome. And then you have like a longer list towards the end that you have of all of these mighty men. You do have Uriah the Hittite mentioned, although this time there's not much time spent on that. So in verse 41, he's just mentioned, but nothing else is said about him, at least for now. In chapter 12, then, you have the mighty men serving David. So you have them coming to support him and helping him. And basically, as he's kind of on the run, especially in Ziklag, when he was trapped by Saul. Saul was on the run. So again, this is kind of reflecting back that these men kind of came to him, started to form around him even before he was king. That's kind of the point of putting it here. I'll just highlight here some of the ways that these tribes and these people help David. So we're told that the Gadites come over to help David, and the Gadites don't get a ton of airtime just in general, but I love this. We're told that these Gadites were officers of the army. The least was a match for 100 men, and the greatest for 1,000. So good job to the Gadites. So like the worst of these Gadite officers could take 100 guys, and the best of them could take 1,000. And so again, these are men who are joining themselves, helping, showing their allegiance to David. You also have different people from Naphtali. You have people, Danites. I think Issachar, we're told in verse 32, these are men who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. So you can see different tribes contributing different ways. So Gadites, these officers, really good fighters. Issachar, they got these really wise men who are really wise and know just what's the best decisions to be made. And so kind of just cool to see that. Chapter 13, we recount the story of the ark being brought from Kiriath Jearim, which again, that's where just a quick reminder. So the ark in the promised land was in Shiloh, right? So there was Eli the high priest. He had Hophni and Phinehas, his sons, who were really bad, really sinful. The people of Israel lost the Philistines. They brought the ark out in battle. The Philistines captured it. And eventually through this kind of like these tumors and mice and stuff, the Philistines sent the ark back to Israel. And then it got settled in Kiriath Jearim. And there it was for quite a while. But then after that, David brings it to Jerusalem. And this is recounting the story of David deciding to bring it to Jerusalem. And then if you remember, they put it on a cart, which they were not supposed to do. They were supposed to carry it. And so they hit a bump, and then poor Uzzah reaches out to catch the ark to keep it from hitting the ground. And because he touches it when he shouldn't have, he dies. And then they leave it there for a while in this guy's house named Obed-Edom on his threshing floor. And then God blesses Obed-Edom. And then when David hears about this, eventually he's going to bring it to Jerusalem. Now in chapter 14, we have Hiram, king of Tyre, sending messengers to David and all of this stuff for the sake of Jerusalem and the building up of a palace and a temple. And we're told that David took more wives, fathered more sons, and then we have some more of those children listed. We have the Philistines hearing that David becomes king, and they go up to search for David, and then he battles with them, and ultimately the Lord gives victory. And so they win, and they burn their household gods, and so they aren't tempted to worship those. And then, Lord keeps giving victory to David over the Philistines. And the Lord brought the fear of him upon all the nations. So the surrounding nations really do fear David. They realize that this is a man that God has blessed richly. Chapter 15 then, this is when David officially brings the ark to Jerusalem. And he actually, this time he has the Levites carried on the poles like they were supposed to. And he tells them explicitly in verse 13, because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us, because we did not seek him according to the rule. So again, there's a big attention towards like, hey, let's do things God's way. And you can see that reflected in the fact that I don't remember exactly, but I don't think in 2 Samuel that we were explicitly told that the issue was you didn't put it on a cart, or you put it on a cart instead of carrying it. But here in 1 Chronicles, that part is explicitly recorded for us because the people, again, are this is hopefully telling the people we have to do things God's way. As we look back when things have gone well, it's because we've done it God's way. When we haven't gone God's way, it has not gone well for us. And then at the end of that chapter, you just have all the celebration, the music, the dancing for the ark coming into Jerusalem. You just have a brief reference to Michal, and that was Saul's daughter who David married. I'm looking on her with contempt. And again, we know all that story. It's not elaborated here, but it's just kind of referenced. So then the ark is placed in a tent in chapter 16, and it is now part of, it's in Jerusalem. That's going to be, it's the place that God has decided to make his name dwell. So then after he finished the burnt offerings, this is David, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord and distributed to all Israel, both men and women, to each a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. So having accomplished this, he blesses all the people and feeds them, which is nice. It's a good celebration. If you're a king, you should, throw a party for your people once in a while and celebrate, especially on a big day like this. Then in verse 8, you have this really beautiful song of thanks that kicks off. So it starts off, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the peoples." Some liturgies will actually use a version of this. It's a very, very pretty, memorable song to be sung in worship. And then he recounts the covenants that God has made, the promises he's made with Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. Basically, this recounting that when we were few, we were sojourners in this land, but that you have brought us here, you have strengthened us. So it's kind of a good recap, but also just, again, praising God for what he's done, thanking him for what he's done, and celebrating God's work. And then we're told that David left Asaph and his brothers there before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to minister regularly before the Ark as each day required. So Asaph, the other Levites, are there for singing, for worship, for sacrifices. Zadok, the priest, is there before the tabernacle offering sacrifices. So you can see that, all right, worship is going on as it should. Everything is off and running, and here we go. We're told there was a high place in Gibeon that's going to get absorbed again as we kind of centralize worship, but just a reference there real quick. Chapter 17 then, this is when David decides he wants to build a house to the Lord, and the Lord comes to Nathan the prophet and tells him, no, you're not going to build me a house, but I'm going to build you a house. So it's kind of a nice little reversal there. So this is where the Lord makes him a promise and a covenant that he's going to have a son on the throne forever. And again, this is, I think we talked about this, but it's kind of a short and long-term view that I will take your son and he will be like a son to me and I will be like a father to him. And so this is first fulfilled in Solomon, who does build the temple, but it's better fulfilled in Jesus, who is a son of David, but who also reigns forever and is quite literally God's own son. And so, again, a big passage to understand David's role and the lineage of David and why that is so significant going forward. And then David's going to say a prayer of thanksgiving and thank God for his mercy, the fact that he's brought this shepherd boy who is, seventh born in his family and has made him king of God's people and promised to bless his family and his lineage forever and ever. In chapter 18, then, you have more on David's victories. So he's defeating enemies, Moabites, you have Syrians, you have the people of Gath, which would be the Philistines. So again, you have all of these nations that are subdued, paying tribute. So again, this is building to the high point in Israel's history and just all that is happening. In verse 14, then, chapter 18, you have a bit of a turn because it says, "So David reigned over all Israel, and he administered justice and equity to all his people." So you have here kind of this beautiful picture of David is a good soldier, but he's also a good administrator as a king. Sometimes those things aren't always paired. There's different skills required for both, but David is one who administers with justice and equity, and that is a blessing to his people. And that's what we pray for civil leaders today. May they rule with justice, may they rule with equity, and may they bring about peace, which is what David has accomplished here. So really good. Again, things are off and running quite nicely. Chapter 19, we're told the recount of the story of when the Ammonites disgraced David's men. He had sent people to comfort the Ammonite king when his parents died, and then they shave off their beards and they cut their robes, and it becomes a battle, and the Ammonites hire the Syrians to come help fight with them, and then David's army wins, and basically the Syrians are like, we're not helping you Ammonites anymore. Chapter 20, we have the capturing of Rabbah again. That's a city that David had conquered. Specifically, I guess Joab had conquered it and then called David in to help out and to receive the crown and get the glory for it. Kind of a cool picture for doing your duty, but giving glory to your king. In verse 4 then, this is verse 4 to the end of this chapter, chapter 20, we have all of these giants. So these are the family of Goliath. So we're told that there's other giants too. These descendants of these Nephilim, these Anakim that we talked about earlier. We're told that David's brother struck down one. You have all sorts. You have one guy with one of these giants has 6 fingers in each hand and 6 toes in each foot, 24 in number. So you have all of these kind of big creatures, but again, the point being that David and his mighty men ultimately take them down and are victorious, even against these, mighty soldiers. Now, chapter 21, this is maybe the most notorious difference between the account that we have in Samuel and Kings and the accounts that we have in the book of Chronicles. Because chapter 21 is the story of that census that David took. And if you remember, he took a census, he wanted to count his people, and it was not good. And because of it, as you'll reread, God gives an option and ultimately picks a 3-day pestilence. Now, here's the big difference, and it hits you in the face right off the bat. If you remember, in 2 Samuel, we're told that God was angry with David and incited him to take the census. Now, if you read 1 Chronicles chapter 21, we're told, then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. So one book says that God's the one who did this. The other book says that Satan did this. And that raises a really interesting question of who was it, right? And I actually think we're better equipped to handle this question now that we've read the book of Job, because I think, part of the tension that we're going to find always is that God would use even evil. He would use even suffering, and even by what he allows Satan to do, he still uses those for the purpose that he cares and wants to carry out. And so just like in Job, in one way, God was doing this to Job. He inflicted Job. And in another sense, more specifically, it was Satan who was inflicting Job, and God was allowing it. I think similarly, we can probably think of this kind of along those same lines, where God wants to judge David and Israel because of their sin, pridefulness, whatever it might be. We're not told exactly what caused it. And he allowed Satan to incite David in this way, right? He didn't hold Satan back this time. I think that's probably the best way to understand it. It's a lot like if you remember the story where King Ahab is getting ready to go to battle, and him and the king of Judah, they're inquiring of their prophets, and the prophets are all like, yeah, you're going to win. And then they ask, I think it's Micaiah, the prophet. And Micaiah is like, yeah, you're going to win. And they're like, no, tell us truthfully. And Micaiah says, I saw basically this kind of this holy council, right? So God and his council. And God said, who will go for me and send a lying spirit among the prophets. And this one spirit stepped forward and said, I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of the prophets. So in that vision that this prophet got, it's God who's wanting to judge King Ahab, and he does so by allowing a spirit, presumably a demon, to mislead the prophets, to give them false visions. So I think similarly in this story, understand it as God is angry with David and Israel for something, and so he allows Satan to tempt David to do the wrong thing. That's the best reading, I think, the best way to render it. Some people will accuse this of being later authors trying to make God look better by changing it from God to Satan. And I understand that, but I still think when you line it up with stories like Micaiah, the prophet, and what he shared, and you line it up with stories like Job, I think it actually makes a lot of sense that God can judge people by pulling back his protection and allowing Satan or other demons or spirits to wreak havoc. So regardless, that's what we have. So we have Satan here standing against David and tempting him to do the census. So David calls Joab, his commander of the army, to go and number Israel. And Joab actually is kind of onto this. He's like, this is weird. He says, are they not my lord, the king, all of them my lord's servants? So, hey, they all belong to you. So why then should my lord require this? Why should it be a cause of guilt for Israel? So he knows, Joab knows, this is not right. We shouldn't be numbering the people. Like, just enjoy the fact that you're king over all this people. Like, because all you're doing by taking a census is trying to aggrandize, right? I'm trying to promote how great I am. I'm the king of this many people, rather than just being content with I'm the king of Israel. Right? It'd be like if you're trying to walk around, if I was a pastor and I'm going around to pastors' conferences, well, let me tell you how big my congregation is, right? Let me tell you how many people I have, or I'm the president of this big of a country, right? You're just using it at this point for your own ego, rather than just, hey, regardless, I'm the pastor of this church. It doesn't matter how many people are there. My job is still to shepherd those people, to preach the word to those people, to care for those people, whether it's a lot or a little, right? And all I'm doing, in this case, all David is doing is trying to puff up his own ego by how many people he has. So Joab does not like this. He does not care for this, but it's his order, so he goes and does it. We're told that when he goes and he starts counting, it says in all Israel there was 1,100,000 men who drew the sword. So you have 1.1 million men, so not women and not children, so just men old enough and young enough to fight in an army. And in Judah, you have 470,000 more, so about 500,000 more who drew the sword. But he did not include Levi and Benjamin in the numbering, for the king's command was abhorrent to Joab. So Joab is ticked by all this, so he doesn't even count the Levites or the Benjamites. So you have about 1.6 million soldiers, fighting-age men, not counting women and children or elderly, and you have the Levites and Benjamin. But immediately, we're told in verse 7, God was displeased with this thing, and he struck Israel. And David knows that he sinned. He chooses the pestilence. And then you have this whole sequence again where there's kind of this angel standing over between heaven and earth, casting judgment upon Jerusalem and upon the people. And ultimately, David's instructed to build an altar, and God calls the pestilence to cease. So again, God judges for David's sin, but God also relents. He doesn't make a full end of anybody, or of the people at least, and ultimately withdraws. And again, it's twofold. People suffer for David's sin, which is a good reminder. People in a church suffer when a pastor sins, and people in a country suffer when their leader sins. It erodes trust. They might launder money. There's ripple effects when a leader sins. Same thing with parents. Parents' shortcomings affect spouses and children and so on. It's just a reality of life, the way that God has made it. So people suffer for David's sins, even though they maybe didn't sin. But also in terms of David, he also, he's trying to count how many people he has, and immediately a bunch of those people are struck down. It's almost in trying to aggrandize yourself, God's kind of taking you down a notch. And so you see that a little bit. But you have this temple being built then, or this altar being built, and then ultimately there's where the temple's going to be. So this spot where God tells his angel to cease and relent from judgment becomes the place where the temple and God kind of meets his people on earth is found, kind of this bridge between heaven and earth, which obviously is not an accident. So then in chapter 22, we have David preparing for the temple. So just a reminder, Solomon's the one who builds the temple. What we see here is that David does a lot of the preparation. he spends a lot of the time gathering the materials, drawing the plans, so that Solomon can just kind of take it and run. So he starts to pull together resident aliens to work on this. So to pull those who were not of the people of Israel, but were living in that territory, to recruit them for work. And we're told that in verse 6, he charges Solomon with this. So this is a reminder too, that when you read 2 Samuel to 1 Kings, you have Bathsheba coming to David and saying, hey, didn't you say that Solomon was going to be the one who was going to reign? And at the time you're like, I don't remember him making that promise, right? Because David's other son was going to make himself king. But here we actually see that David had charged Solomon specifically with becoming king. So this was already decided. So Bathsheba was not pulling a fast one. She was just recounting what David had already promised. So Solomon is the one who is going to build the temple. And here we're told why David's not the one who's going to build. So explicitly we're told in verse 8 that God has told David that you have shed much blood and you're a man of war, right? You've fought, you've killed, and so you're not the one who's going to build a temple, but your son, a son of peace. So Solomon's not fighting in wars. He's not sending out armies. He's a king who's going to rule over in a time of peace. And so he's the one who's going to build the temple. Okay, so because of David's bloodshed, which was not wrong, right? He was supposed to fight God's enemies when they were invading. But because of that, he's not, you could say, consecrated or fit or clean for the building of the temple. And instead, Solomon's the one who should do it. I'll highlight this too. When David is talking to Solomon, he's talking about you're going to succeed in this. The Lord be with you. Basically, do what the Lord has told you to do. He says in verse 13, this is chapter 22, verse 13, then you will prosper if you are careful to observe the statutes and the rules that the Lord commanded Moses for Israel. Be strong and courageous. Fear not. Do not be dismayed. Now, that is a lot like Joshua 1:8, where they're getting ready into the promised land, and Joshua says, be strong and courageous. Do not fear, for the Lord is with you. And I love this because in Joshua, right, it makes sense why you shouldn't be afraid because you're about to go fight in battles. Like you're going to risk your life and you're going to go fight people trying to kill you and take a land that's, not yet yours that God has promised. But I love that in this passage, the command to be strong and courageous is in light of building the temple, that there's something courageous about doing this great task. And I think it's a reminder for anyone who would endeavor to do anything significant, obviously, and all of us should hope to live a life of significance in terms of, like, it's a big task to follow Christ and to live according to his will. It's a big undertaking to serve one's neighbor. It's a big undertaking to have a family and raise kids. And it's a big undertaking to care for the needy and maybe put yourself out there. It's a big undertaking to do ministry and to help invest in a church. And we don't know exactly how that's going to look or how many people are going to come and, how are we going to make this work? But the call for Solomon that in light of building this temple, be strong and courageous because the Lord will bless you, right? That there's courage needed in building the temple. And I think there's courage needed to carry out ministry and to follow Christ today as well. Not just for fighting wars, right? Not just for going into battle, but just for following the Lord as he would lead. In chapter 23 then, we have David organizing all of the Levites. Again, he's just getting everything ready for the temple and all the gatekeepers. You have all of these people in charge of officers, judges. You have 4,000 people offering praise with instruments. So again, just imagine like a band. You have 4,000 musicians to work with. Like, that's remarkable. I'll highlight this too. I love in the start of chapter 23, it says, when David was old and full of days. Now, I might have said this before, so I apologize if I have, but that phrase will show up a handful of times in the Old Testament, full of days. And I think it's just a great way to think of life. Like when it's, yes, you've lived however many years. Yes, you're an old man or woman, but the idea that your life was full of days. You've had many days, and to see each day as part of that life. Each day is a gift, right? And as we read in Lamentations not long ago, his mercies are new every morning. Every day God is good, and every day God is faithful. So you have all of these different people rounded up for the service of the temple. I mean, I think it's like 38,000 men listed just here helping out with the temple work. We're told here too that they no longer need to carry the tabernacle. So if you remember back in like Exodus, God had given them instructions on how they're supposed to move the tabernacle, right? Here's who's going to like camp out on this side of it, and then Levites carry this and so on. But if you think about it now, the tabernacle has found its final home, right, in the temple. And so those laws are no longer needed. The instructions for carrying the tent and the ark are gone because it has found its kind of, hopefully final resting point. Obviously, it's not going to be its final resting point, and ultimately the tabernacle is Christ. But that's what we have here. You have those who are 20 plus helping out with duties in the temple. And then in chapter 24, you have more organization of the priests and their roles. So we're going to put a pause there for this week. And the next week, we're going to finish 1 Chronicles, move into 2 Chronicles. But hopefully this is starting to help jog some memories and just, again, kind of get the big, wide angle lens view of things. Let's kind of step back and go from Adam to David to exile, and let's kind of get the whole big picture as we get ourselves ready to go into the New Testament. Now, as we close out today, I had a question sent in, and it was regarding something I said when we were talking about the book of Esther. I had made a comment when the king had called in all of the women from King Ahasuerus, had called in all the women to be his, to possibly be his queen. And I had made a comment about called in all the virgins, which means unmarried women. And the question basically said, I've always understood the word virgin to be specifically in relation to somebody's sexual history. Here you said it means unmarried. Could you just clarify on that? And it's a good question, and I maybe should have been a little bit more careful with my language there. So I think the biggest thing to understand here is that in this cultural context, to be unmarried and to be a virgin, and when I say unmarried, I should say never married, were very much viewed synonymously, right? So if you were ineligible to be married, you typically would have never been married, which would imply that you were a virgin, which is why, if you remember, there was laws back in the Torah about if, somebody's married and then the partner believes that this person is not a virgin. The question was not specifically history. It's just, have you been faithful? Have you been, chaste and pure in your life? And so when I said that, it was more to imply that these are eligible women because they have not been married. The other contrast would be you could be married if you were a widow. Okay, you could get remarried, but typically, I guess in this context, the king did not want a widow as his queen. He wanted somebody who had never been married to anyone before, that he would be their first and only husband. And so that's why he's looking for a young maiden who had also, by implication, likely been a virgin. So that term virgin, it's kind of wrapping up all those ideas wrapped up into one. This is also why you see, if you remember when David's son Absalom slept with his half-sister Tamar, right? She spent the rest of her life unmarried because in this time and place, it just, your chance of getting married after something like that would just been very low. People were looking for somebody who had never been married, who was still considered pure. Again, Jesus has a lot to say in the New Testament about how we view those, even who have committed adultery, who have had sex outside of marriage. But that's why culturally you see the words like maiden, young woman, virgin, all kind of wrapped up in one, because it would have implied kind of all of these things going together, especially in a time and place where if you did commit adultery and you were caught in it, you would be put to death. There was a death penalty. So you did not have a whole lot of people who were just known for going around and sleeping with people and then just going about their day and then one day deciding to get married because it was considered such a high offense at the time. Obviously, we don't put people to death for that today, obviously. And obviously, even for those who have had sex outside of marriage, well, that's not God's will. In Christ, we come to him, and all of us have defiled God's law. All of us have fallen short. And he is the one who offers forgiveness. He is the one who removes our shame and bestows upon us honor, the honor of being his daughter or his son, and his forgiveness and his salvation. And so even from then, we can, start again. While the consequences sometimes of those past events might play out in this world, we know that God has removed our judgment in Christ when we come to him, when we repent, when we ask for forgiveness, and he offers us a future where even then he can still lead to happy marriages or a holy life even beyond that. Hopefully that was helpful, but that's why maybe I made that comment. I should have been more clear in the moment. But if any other questions about Esther or anything else that we've talked about or that we haven't talked about, feel free to send it in. You can email us at podcast@renewaldenver.org or go to renewaldenver.org/Bible in a year and fill out the question form there. We'd love to hear any questions, anything that we can clarify or help you on. It is a joy to receive those and to hear from you. And I'll just say this too. It's been great to hear how much positive feedback we've gotten. If you know somebody who's never read the Bible or maybe is curious and you want to send them this reading plan and this podcast, or if you want to leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anything just to help get people connected to this, we would love to be a blessing and help get people plugged into God's Word. But with that, I'm going to send you upon your week. And so I want to leave you with this blessing. As always, may the word of Jesus renew you day by day until life everlasting. Take care.